in Google on the subject. My overall observation as a biographer is that the problem with depicting history on film is that it is so vivid and so memorable. And in the case of The Crown, the gorgeous production values, the fantastic acting, and the really clever writing have led many viewers, probably most viewers, to take what they see at face value. And it's really only the people like me who have immersed themselves in the topic who can say what is true and what is false. And having actually also worked with The Crown's creator, Peter Morgan, on his play about the Queen and her prime ministers called The Audience, I understand his technique, which is to use some truth and then embellish it with lots and lots of fictional drama, but more of that later. Each year seems to bring another set of milestones for the royal family. In 2017, the British media went into overdrive last summer to cover the 20th anniversary of the death of Diana. In audio tapes and previously unseen videos, Diana spoke from beyond the grave with very harsh words about Prince Charles that really took a toll on his standing in public. But he stoically went about his business, and he remained silent through what were several very difficult months for him. On a happier note, this past November, in case you've all been living under a rock, Prince Harry and the American actress Meghan Markle announced their engagement. And it came just a week after the Queen and Prince Philip celebrated their platinum wedding anniversary, which marked a record-breaking 70 years of marriage. Prince Charles, as Anda alluded to earlier, has now broken some records of his own. He has waited the longest to become monarch. He is the longest-serving Prince of Wales. And when he eventually does become king, he will be the oldest person in British history to take the throne, surpassing King William IV, who was crowned at age 64 in 1830. As Charles waits for his ultimate job, he continues to be profoundly misunderstood, stereotyped as an old fogey, and blamed for the unhappiness of Princess Diana during their turbulent 11-year marriage. But he is equally the man who called, wait a minute, why isn't this moving? Help. Tech support. Okay. He is equally the man who counted Joan Rivers as a friend and affectionately called her Miss Potty Mouth. He was also cheered as Charlie My Darling by unemployed workers in a poor corner of Scotland. I thought I knew Prince Charles pretty well after writing books about his mother and his late wife, but it was really not until I examined him up close that I began to appreciate the forces that shaped him in the stunning array of interests and pursuits, not to mention his accomplishments. To just skim the surface, he has created scores of charities to benefit underprivileged youth and even endangered red squirrels. You're going to have to tell me how I can get rid of this thing. Escape. Okay, now I know I have to press 2 buttons. Even endangered red squirrels. He wrote 10 books and contributed to more than a dozen documentaries. He has been an active and engaged patron of more than 400 organizations. He founded schools for architects, artists, teachers, and craftsmen. And he built Poundbury, which is a model town in Dorset where thousands of people live and work together from all economic backgrounds, and where the streets were designed, as you can see, with pedestrians, not cars, in mind. He launched a successful line of food and other products called Duchy Originals, and he restored 112 historic buildings in the old quarter of Kabul, Afghanistan, where he also created a traditional arts institute, and you can see some of their products in that picture. He transformed Dumfries House, which was a crumbling estate in Scotland, into a center of tourism and training and employment, which has raised the level of, it hasn't erased the poverty level, but it has certainly raised the economic level in that very poor part of Scotland. He takes pride in being a watercolor artist, and he sells lithographs of his work for $4,000 and more to benefit his charities. And to an unexpected degree, he has relied on Americans for inspiration and guidance, including advisors and financial supporters. I also learned how different he is from his mother. As the longest reigning, and at age 91, almost 92, she is the oldest monarch in British history, and she is unique. Charles, however, is an original. When I asked his cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, which of his parents he most resembled, she paused and she chuckled and she said, I think he might be a changeling. While the Queen is a model of serenity and stability and continuity, Charles is a bundle of quirks and restless energy and insecurities. Since taking the throne at age 25, the Queen has followed the strict routines of a monarch, carrying out her duties with discipline and diligence. Charles, on the other hand, has had a more ad hoc life, mapping out his role as he went along. The Queen has spent a lifetime concealing her thoughts and even her likes and dislikes. Charles has left a trail of fervidly held and often controversial opinions and personal preferences. My challenge with the Queen was to part the curtain and show what she's really like behind her inscrutable facade. For Charles, I needed to get my arms around his sprawling life and make sense of the events and the individuals, many of whom are very little known, that influenced him. I needed to understand the panorama of his interests and to show the threads of his thinking and to explain how over time he changed and how in other ways he stayed the same. I was not quite prepared for such a long journey to understand this complicated and compelling man, even longer than what I took to write about his mother, who is 22 years older. I spent 4 years traveling far and wide, interviewing some 300 people, watching him in action at home and overseas, sometimes having fun while I was doing it. I visited his residences, attended private dinners at Buckingham Palace and St. James's Palace, and I also toured the projects that make him proud. And the 3 words in my subtitle really reflect what I found, which is that he is a man of surprising passions and confounding paradoxes, and that despite his birth as the heir to the British throne, his life has taken many unforeseen twists and turns. Soft on the outside, Charles has what one of his cousins described to me as a moral hardness underneath. In his case, more than most, the experiences of his childhood were crucial in setting the course of his life, but not always in the ways that his parents might have anticipated. He found comfort in the arms of his nanny, Mabel Armstrong, who, by the way, he takes care of to this day. He got her a house in Windsor Great Park, decorated it, and goes still to visit her. And he found company with his grandmother, the Queen Mother, who indulged him and stimulated his appreciation of music and art. His duty-bound mother was preoccupied by her work, and Prince Philip, as head of the family, focused on toughening up his eldest son, who he thought was too sensitive. One of the most touching moments of his childhood was described to me by his cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, and it took place when Charles was 8 years old and he was invited to a luncheon at the home of his great-uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, called Broadlands. And during this lunch, at dessert, they were served wild strawberries. And Charles proceeded to pull the stems off the strawberries and eat them. And while he was doing that, Edwina Mountbatten, Lady Mountbatten, looked over at him and said, "Charles, you're doing it all the wrong way. What you must do is pick up the wild strawberries by the stems, dip them in sugar, and then eat them." Well, a few moments later, Pamela Hicks, his cousin, looked across the table and she saw poor little Charles trying to reattach the stems to all the strawberries on his plate. And to me, that moment said so much about his vulnerability, his eagerness to please, and his need for approval. After his father sent him at age 8 to a boarding school that made him miserable, Prince Philip also insisted that at age 13, Charles attend an even harsher school, Gordonston, in an isolated part of northeastern Scotland. The headmaster sought to build character through physical challenges such as runs at dawn, followed by frigid showers. Philip had flourished there with his athletic ability and his resilient temper. He was the ultimate alpha male, and he was determined for all the right reasons to mold Charles in his own image. But his timid son described his 5 years there as a prison sentence. He was bullied at night in the dormitories, and he was routinely punched on the rugby field. And one of his classmates told me that never once did Charles hit back. Philip intensified the rigor of his son's education by sending him to the Australian outback for 6 months at a wilderness school. There, Charles survived endurance tests such as hiking 70 miles across country in blistering heat, and he showed his father that he was not, in fact, a weakling. He also, for the first time, developed confidence as he faced crowds at royal events and discovered that he could actually talk to strangers. Back at Gordonston, Charles bonded with 2 young teachers. His art master, who I was told had the mind of a Victorian matron and loved to gossip, nurtured Charles's appreciation of high culture. The other teacher encouraged the prince to perform Shakespeare on stage and gave him the lead in Macbeth. But Charles made no friends among his peers. His parents surprisingly admitted that the school had driven him further into himself, and that he had been, as they described it, a square peg in a round hole. Yet Gordonston was important for Prince Charles because it gave him an inner steeliness, and it also made him less conventional. Its emphasis on community service inspired Charles's later efforts to improve the lives of underprivileged young people. His 3 years at Cambridge University offered his first taste of freedom and supposedly a normal existence, but his companions were all handpicked, and his rooms at Trinity College were equipped not only with a private bathroom, but his own kitchen, neither of which was available to any of the other students. He had failed at the classic schoolboys' team sports such as cricket and rugby and soccer, and so he took up polo to impress his father. He practiced on a wooden horse at Windsor Castle until he was ready to take the field with Prince Philip. As time went on, the sport would be an essential release for his frustrations, especially during his marriage to Diana. Without polo, which one of his cousins described to me as aggressive meditation, I love that, Charles said he would have gone stark, staring mad. When he met with reporters at the end of his first year at Cambridge, one of them called Charles a sweet virgin boy. He was not only inexperienced with girls, he was afraid of them. But the master of Trinity College, Rab Butler, arranged Charles's first romance with Lucia Santa Cruz, a beautiful Chilean woman who was 5 years older than Charles. The daughter of a diplomat, she was as brainy as she was gorgeous, with 2 university degrees, which was highly unusual for young women of that era. In the words of Rab Butler's wife, Lucia was someone on whom Charles could safely cut his teeth. One of the Queen's advisors discreetly arranged safe havens for the couple to have their trysts. The romance didn't last, in part because Lucia was Roman Catholic and that was forbidden, but Lucia changed Charles's life in the summer of 1972. He was coming to her London apartment for a drink, and so she invited Camilla Shand, her friend and downstairs neighbor, to join them. Charles lost his heart to Camilla almost immediately. He was drawn to her lively personality, her down-to-earth irreverence, and her love of the countryside and its sporting pursuits. And most of all, she gave him a sympathetic ear and the affection that he yearned for. You could see what a man could see, her friend Lady Annabel Goldsmith told me. An intensely warm, maternal, laughing creature with enormous sex appeal. And I think you can see the magnetism that's evident in this photo, which was taken at a polo match not long after they met. Her family was upper class, with one racy claim to fame. Her great-grandmother, Alice Keppel, was the mistress of Charles's great-great-grandfather, King Edward VII. Camilla actually admired her infamous ancestor so much that she has always had her portrait on the wall of her drawing room. When Charles and Camilla met, he was 23 and she was 25. She had left school at 16, and while she was racing around London with the smart set, Charles was still a boarding school boy. By 1972, she had been involved in an affair for 6 years with a dashing cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles. As her lifelong friend, Lord Patrick Beresford, told me, Camilla was absolutely potty about Andrew, who, as it turned out, had a roving eye for other aristocratic women, including Charles's sister, Princess Anne. And there is probably a Venn diagram that you can do for that one, but I haven't been able to figure it out. But starting that summer in 1972, Andrew was conveniently on overseas duty for 6 months. So Camilla was free to enjoy the attentions of the heir to the throne, who was thrilled to have found a woman he could love and cherish. While Charles was powerfully attracted to her, he was not ready to settle down. Also, as his cousin and godmother, Patricia Mountbatten, put it to me, Camilla had a history. And Charles was expected to marry a woman who at least appeared to be virginal. Still, when he left England in January 1973 for a posting with the Royal Navy, he expected Camilla to be there for him when he returned 8 months later. Meanwhile, her father and Andrew Parker Bowles' father, who were very good friends, conspired to publish an engagement notice that appeared in the Times of London on March 15, 1973. The public announcement forced Andrew to stop dithering and finally proposed to Camilla. And I don't think even the Crown could make up that little plot twist. They were married at the Guards Chapel in London on the 4th of July, with the Queen and Princess Anne, his ex-girlfriend, among the guests. Charles, who was in Antigua at the time, was completely blindsided by the news, and he could not understand why his blissful relationship with Camilla had ended so abruptly. As an officer in the Navy, Charles fell under the sway of his great-uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the younger brother of Philip's mother. Dickie Mountbatten was a heroic figure to Charles. Dickie's godmother was Queen Victoria, who had actually held him in her arms during his christening, and that was just one of the many magical links that Dickie had to the royal family's past. So as Charles's parents were going about their royal duties, Dickie had the time to give the insecure prince attention, encouragement, and affection. But he also gave Charles some pretty bad advice on love and marriage, urging him to sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as possible before he could settle down with a sweet charactered girl he could put on a pedestal. Rather than learning from mature relationships, Charles spent his 20s in a series of flings. The most surprising of these was an American admiral's daughter, Laura Jo Watkins. Charles met her in San Diego on shore leave in March 1974. Although at age 20 she was 5 years younger, she astutely observed that Charles had the contemplative streak of an old soul. He invited her to London, where reporters pursued her until she finally had to flee the American ambassador's residence, dressed in a sailor's suit to disguise her. The press at that point thought the romance was over, but Charles secretly invited Laura to stay with him in Nassau. I learned how a sympathetic friend arranged for the couple to spend 3 idyllic days in a beautiful beach house in the Bahamas, fittingly called Xanadu. They only saw each other one more time, but they maintained a friendly correspondence. And when Charles married Diana, Laura Jo Watkins sat unnoticed in the congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral. All the women Charles dated in the 1970s, many of them daughters of dukes and earls and other noblemen, fell short, including Diana's older sister, Sarah. The most promising prospect was Charles's cousin, Amanda Knatchbull, who was Dickie Mountbatten's granddaughter. She was 9 years younger than Charles, but she was self-possessed, smart, sensible, and strong. Dickie pushed the match, not surprisingly, and Charles even proposed marriage, but she politely turned him down because there was no chemistry, and she did not want to settle for anything less than a love match. Wherever Charles went during those years, he drew crowds of adoring fans. On a trip to Los Angeles, his fingers were swollen and covered with cuts from diamond rings of the women who had grasped his hand so tightly. "It's why the Queen wears gloves," he said to one of his aides. The tabloids called him Action Man, and his exploits dominated the headlines. He played polo, he learned to ski, and he took up windsurfing. He also began fox hunting, at least in part to be near Camilla Parker Bowles. They had crossed paths again when Andrew's polo team competed against Charles's. And in early 1975, Charles joined Camilla on the field at the prestigious Beaufort Hunt. Now, this was noteworthy because he had been terrified of jumping on horseback since childhood, but he overcame his fears and threw himself into the sport. He and Camilla both rode with a Beaufort, shared the thrill of the chase, and she became his confidant. By 1978, Camilla had given up on her husband, who was busy philandering his way through London to the extent that he earned the nickname Andrew Poker Bowles. Toward the end of 1978, Camilla and Charles resumed their love affair. By then, Charles was starting to create a role for himself that went far beyond cutting ribbons and unveiling plaques. He had a private income of more than $500,000 a year, which in today's values would be about $3.5 million. His first major project was the Prince's Trust, which he set up in 1976. And his idea was to transform the lives of disadvantaged youth by giving them small grants for self-help projects. and his hope was that these young people could achieve something and become responsible adults. It would be his most celebrated charity, with an impressive track record over 4 decades of helping nearly 1 million young people learn skills and find employment. Charles celebrated his 40th birthday with 1,500 grateful recipients and danced vigorously with 3 young women, one of whom said afterward, "He told me I was a good mover. He dances pretty well for an old man." The public Charles was busy launching charities, but the private man had become a full-fledged spiritual seeker under the influence of a series of gurus. When Charles took up watercolors at 21, he said that painting transported him into another dimension and refreshed his soul. In his mid-20s, he befriended Lawrence Vanderpost, a well-known South African writer. Vanderpost instructed Charles in the theories of psychologist Carl Jung and taught him that primitive people should be revered for their relationship to the spirit of the earth. With Vanderpost's help, Charles began his lifelong quest to build connections with nature and between disciplines, religions, and cultures, which is an effort that would be one of Charles's defining traits. Charles also, in Jungian fashion, recorded his dreams for Vanderpost's wife Ingrid, and over the next 5 years, he periodically met with her for therapy sessions. In August 1979, Dickie Mountbatten was assassinated by terrorists from the Irish Republican Army. Charles said he felt agony, disbelief, and wretched numbness. He had Camilla to console him, but he needed a wife to support and understand him. At age 31, he was feeling pressure from his family and the media to settle down, do his duty, and produce the next in line to the throne. He proposed to 19-year-old Lady Diana Spencer after they had been together only a dozen times, with just a few private moments. But he figured he could learn to love Diana, who had charmed him with her beauty and her warmth. But their 12-year age gap was unbridgeable. They had no intellectual connections, few mutual friends, and really no interests in common. Nor did Charles know that Diana had a history of emotional instability dating back to her parents' traumatic divorce when she was 6 years old. His hasty choice set off the most acrimonious and mortifying 16 years of his life. It was really beyond imagining that what seemed like a fairy tale wedding would lead to divorce, and barely a year later, Diana's death at age 36 in a car crash in Paris. Charles had tried to make his marriage work, and he had, in fact, given up his affair with Camilla for 5 years until, as he admitted in a TV documentary in 1994, his relationship with Diana had irretrievably broken down. Yet during those personally painful years, Charles came into his own as the Prince of Wales. He became an evangelist on the dangers of climate change. Charles challenged the medical establishment for failing to take consideration of the whole patient. He criticized modern farming for its use of chemicals and genetically engineered crops. And he famously condemned modern architecture for being elitist and for failing to consider the wishes of ordinary people. With his enterprises and his charities, Charles was determined to convince everyone that he was a serious social observer, and he wanted to make the world a better place. If the Queen's job was, in the words of one of her long-standing advisors, to spread a carpet of happiness, Charles felt compelled to dwell on the carpet's holes and tears that he desperately wanted to repair. As thoughts occurred to him, He jots them down while tramping across the countryside, keeping endless bits of paper in every single jacket. And late in the evening, he furiously writes letters and memos, always with a fountain pen. He shuns computers and avoids what he calls emails. Oops, wait a minute, sorry. Instead, he fills the pages of his crested stationery with his distinctively thick black handwriting, creating what have been nicknamed his black spider letters. He sends bunches of them every day to advisors, friends, politicians, gardeners, architects, even people he's just met. And they range from detailed instructions for his projects to tender condolence notes. At Highgrove, his estate in Gloucestershire, he created an ambitious garden that was, by his description, the outward expression of my inner self. Its unusual features include a neo-Victorian stumpery and also topiary hedges that are modeled on Platonic and Archimedean solids that represent earth, water, fire, and the universe. Little do visitors know that from time to time, Prince Charles lies on the floor near the window of his house to hear what the people are saying as they walk through his garden. Tucked away from prying eyes is Charles's sanctuary. The intimate design was based on Charles's exact measurements. The bricks are made of local clay, and everything is handcrafted. To enter, Charles manipulates 2 of the 4 doorknobs in a secret combination because he does not carry keys. He calls it the place where nobody can get to me. Charles is an unorthodox mixture of traditional and modern. He is a strong proponent of green energy, and Poundbury, his model town in Dorset, relies on plant waste to produce renewable fuel in a cutting-edge facility. Yet, on his organic farm, he raises endangered breeds of livestock, and he discourages his employees from using mechanized tractors. Instead, he asks them to use heavy horses and scythes. He also learned the ancient art of hedge laying, and from October through March every year, he spends hours bending and cutting branches with axes and handsaws to construct his hedges. He is, in fact, defined by his oddities as much as he is by his ideas. He drains his bathtub with a hand pump attached to a hose that extends out his bathroom window that he uses to water his garden. His cloakroom in Kensington Palace was fitted out with antique toilets that he used as coat racks. And at banquets, he usually eats his own meal with all organic ingredients prepared by his personal chef. He also has a pillow on his seat to ease his back pain. Even the Queen doesn't get that. A friend of mine who sat next to Charles at a Windsor Castle dinner noticed a beautiful bowl in front of his place and said, "Sir, what's in that bowl?" And he said, "Oh, that's my salt. My people take very good care of me. They bring my own salt." Eccentric, as I said. After the death of Diana in August 1997, Charles had to rebuild his life, taking comfort from a sign that hung in his dressing room that said, "Be patient and endure." And his crucial achievement was to convince the world that he was a loving and responsible parent to William and Harry. One of the most unfair accusations made by Diana in the biography by Andrew Morton that she authorized in 1992 was that Charles was a bad father. There was a moment during a trip that Diana and Charles took to Canada in the fall of 1992 with William and Harry on the Royal Yacht Britannia when that impression really took hold. It occurred as Diana ran to her sons with outstretched arms and hugged them before masses of cameras to create an iconic image of the princess as an affectionate mother. Well, Charles lagged behind his wife, and he also embraced his boys. But with the exception of one French-Canadian newspaper, the media ignored Charles's hug, which was not the story that they wanted to tell. A woman who actually witnessed the hug shared this newspaper clipping with me, and it is the only evidence that exists. When I tried to find the picture for my book, it had disappeared from the photographer's archives. Prince Philip ruled his son with an iron grip until Charles left the Navy and could begin to craft his own life. Charles gave his sons much more latitude to have a relatively normal life, even shopping at supermarkets. Their grandmother was also a very important force. William called the Queen a strong female influence he could look up to. As one of William and Harry's advisors told me, they were two guys on a raft after the shipwreck of their parents' marriage, and they made it to shore, which brought them together. Unlike Charles and his siblings, who work on their own, William and Harry knew that they could have a multiplier effect by operating as a team. And as they grew older, Charles permitted them to choose experienced advisors to guide them in creating their roles, two highly regarded military officers and a veteran diplomat. William's views reflect a broader public consensus than his father's more controversial approach. As his senior advisor told me, William is like his grandmother. He gets on with his duty. He dedicates himself to doing the job. He is not flashy. He is not an entrepreneur. He is not a ruffler. After William married Kate, she turned their team into a dynamic trio. And she understands how to use her charisma and her style, but she keeps the spotlight very much on her husband. William and Kate combine informality with dignity, and yet they understand the power that comes from mystery. As one of the Queen's cousins told me, she can see continuity with William and Kate and their children, and that has changed her life. With his wedding to Meghan Markle in May, Harry will begin building his own family. On the birth of William and Kate's third child next month, Harry will drop from fifth to sixth in the royal line of succession. But he remains one of the most popular members of the royal family, and he holds a special place in public favor as Diana's second son. Today, Meghan appeared for the first time at a major royal event presided over by the Queen, the annual Commonwealth Day service in Westminster Abbey. And just a couple of weeks ago, Meghan made her first appearance with her future husband, William and Kate, at a forum in London to promote the charitable foundation that they have operated since 2009. They each spoke earnestly about their philanthropic work that they can do together, and it took about a second for the British tabloid press to name them the Fab Four. As Harry said, we are really looking forward to working as a pair and as a foursome, and hoping we can make as much of a difference where we can. Over the past 5 years, Charles has been streamlining his philanthropies while assuming more work on behalf of the Queen when she began stepping back as she approached her 90th birthday in 2016. Charles is now more comfortable in his own skin, and the warmth of his relationship with his mother was evident in his 90th birthday tribute film when they reminisced together while watching old family home movies together. The principal force in Charles's life has been Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, since their wedding in 2005. Their on and off love story has stretched over more than 40 years. It has been framed by a deep and abiding bond, by Charles's loyalty and devotion to Camilla, and Camilla's understanding and support. Joan Rivers, who befriended Camilla in the years after Diana's death, saw her as someone who could be rowdy with him and silly with him and normal with him. And at age 57, Camilla adapted well to royal routines. And most important of all, she won over the Queen with her down-to-earth unfussiness and that she loves her dogs and her horses. And like the Queen, she has kept a consistent hairstyle over the years. Thanks to a hairdresser who travels with her and always has an ample supply of fake hair to make sure that her tiaras are comfortable. Camilla will likely be crowned queen when Charles takes the throne. Constitutional experts say that under English common law, Camilla has every right to the title of queen, and that to have anything less would be unacceptably inferior. Queen Elizabeth II now has 3 generations of heirs in direct succession: Charles, William, and William's son, George. But there is no mechanism to skip her eldest son and give the crown to William. Charles turned 70 this November, so his reign will be far shorter than his mother's record-breaking 66 years and counting. And for that reason, Charles will be remembered mainly for his achievements as Prince of Wales. Mary Soames, the youngest daughter of Sir Winston Churchill, was a great admirer of Prince Charles, said to me that she thought that he had improved each shining hour in his wait for the crown. As king, he has the potential to inspire as a unifying force above and beyond politics, with a different style and tone from the Queen. He can be expected probably to show his feelings a bit more and to speak more naturally and probably more frequently than his mother. By conducting himself with dignity and seriousness of purpose, yet keeping a lid on his opinions, by respecting royal traditions, by showing his sense of duty, as well as his humanity and his charm, he could well win the affection and admiration that he has long sought. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Hi. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A. If you will raise your hand, Lisa and I will come do Phil Donahue style.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. Since you're the expert and the Google of the House of Windsor, I'd like to know what you think of, if given a free reign, if Princess Diana were living, who would make a better monarch, Princess Diana or Prince Charles? And secondly, I'd also like to know how would you describe Kate Middleton and Princess Diana?
Well, there wasn't an option for Princess Diana ever to be monarch. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think she was prepared to be a monarch. I don't think she was trained to be a monarch. I think she was temperamentally probably not suited to being a monarch. She did, as I discovered when I was writing my book about her, have significant emotional and even mental health issues that were not created by Prince Charles and were in fact deeply rooted. I interviewed the headmistress and the matron of her boarding school, and even back then she had suffered from bulimia and anorexia and sort of a compulsive behavior and had problems. And none of this, of course, was known to Charles when he married her. I think the best, happiest life she could have had would have been to marry a country squire and be away from the limelight. One of the problems with marrying into the royal family for Diana was that it amplified her insecurities and made her sort of obsessed with how she was depicted in public. And so it was sort of the worst possible place for her to have gone, even though it has to be said that she and Charles produced two wonderful young men. And I think Charles, she was a very affectionate mother. There's no doubt about that. She introduced William and Harry to aspects of life that members of the royal family had not previously been exposed to. She took them to be with people suffering from AIDS. She took them to homeless encampments. She did a lot of things that opened their eyes and I think made them into more sensitive young men, boys and young men. So there were a lot of things. She had a sense of fun, and they spent a lot of time last summer talking about all the good things she did. But I think it was getting to be problematic. I think it was, if she had, I mean, it was a terrible tragedy, but I think if she had lived, it would have been extremely difficult for Charles to rebuild his life as he has and to make the continuing contributions he has. Kate Middleton, I think, is much more out of the traditional mold of a future queen consort. She is, she knew what she was getting in for. I mean, they have had a very modern relationship, unlike Charles and Diana, who, as I pointed out, had only been together a dozen times. William and Kate were allowed to live together for 8 years. I mean, the sort of thing, when you go back and you consider that Princess Margaret wasn't allowed to marry Peter Townsend because he was divorced, and that everything they did was scandalous. And the idea of living with somebody before marriage was just unheard of. So William and Kate had that opportunity to get to know each other. She knew exactly what she was getting into in marrying into the royal family. And, you know, other than being photographed by a very, very, very long lens when she and William were staying in I guess it was southern France, with David Lindley and his wife, and she was photographed topless, but it was barely discernible. She really hasn't put a foot wrong. So I think she has been trained and is training herself to be the kind of perfect queen consort for William when he eventually takes the throne. You're welcome.
I've always been a great fan of Charles and his willingness to speak his mind, such as when he described British architects as having done more damage to the London skyline than the Luftwaffe did.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, Paternoster Square. Yes, he did say that.
My question is, if the Queen survives for another 6-7 years, which seems highly possible,
it does. She still rides on horseback.
And and she doesn't seem at all inclined to step back for Charles.
No.
But if she does that, would it not behoove Charles to consider stepping back for Will?
Well, that is the big A question, the abdication question. And there are two parts to it, really. One is the 1936 abdication of King Edward VIII was a very, very traumatic experience for the royal family, and it injected a note of instability. He was the first monarch to willingly step down, and the whole concept of the monarchy is this, continuous tradition that is not broken in such a way. And so it raised a lot of questions about the monarchy and its existence and its survival. And it was only really through the efforts of his successor, his younger brother, King George VI, and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, that they were able to restore the prestige of the monarchy. And then, of course, become an inspirational couple during World War II as they toughed out, along with everybody else in London, what everybody went through in the Blitz and beyond. So there's that part. There's that even though the result of it was that we had the Queen since 1952. But it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of people who think, I mean, if he had stayed on the throne, Edward VIII, it's highly unlikely he and Wallis Simpson would have ever had children. And so Elizabeth would have become queen anyway, but probably in the early 70s, say. But getting back to the abdication, that sort of marked the royal family, and that's a no-go area. But more significant is the coronation. And I didn't really understand the significance of the coronation until I spoke to some Anglican clergy, and they said, you must understand that the coronation's not about necessarily getting that 7-pound crown put on your head. It's really about the anointing with holy oil and the sacred vow to serve under God until your death. And she is a very religious woman. She takes that vow very seriously. She has restated it only a few times in her life. When she turned 21, you've probably seen the clip. It's been reproduced many times. She was in South Africa, and she said, I pledge to you, whether my life be long or short, I will devote myself to this one, which was then imperial family. And then again, she restated it a couple of times at various jubilees, that she was in it for life. She said it privately. Her wonderful, now late cousin, Margaret Rhodes, told me a conversation that they had when one of the archbishops of Canterbury just, had to step down, as they do, and she said, I can never do that. He can retire, but I can't. And then there was this wonderful moment when Pope Benedict decided that he was going to step down. And there was a meme that went around the internet that had a picture of Pope Benedict on top and a picture of the Queen on the bottom, and it just said in large letters, "Wuss." So yeah, I think that was her thought balloon, and then the third part of the answer is that the English, being a very practical bunch, have something called the 1937 Regency Act, which was enacted after the abdication. And basically it's kind of like our 25th, the fourth clause of our 25th Amendment, only I think it's even more effective and simpler. But it's that several members of the civil service plus one close relative of the monarch can decide among themselves, in the face of pretty overwhelming evidence, that the monarch is unfit to carry out, either physically or mentally, to carry out duties, in which case Prince Charles would become the Prince Regent, which is what happened back in the 19th century, or the 18th century, I guess, when King George III got porphyria or whatever unglued him. And his son became the Prince Regent and eventually King George IV. So that I see as the option that could happen if something happens to her, if she gets a stroke or some terrible illness that makes it impossible. Because even though she has been cutting back and is less visible publicly, I just talked to one of her private secretaries about a week ago, and she is still busy doing investitures. She's meeting with the prime minister every Wednesday at 6:15. She's greeting ambassadors, taking credentials, meeting with the Privy Council. All this stuff she's doing behind closed doors. Plus, she goes out on the weekends at Windsor Castle and she rides her fell ponies. So, she's very much engaged, but she's practical enough to know that she can't go trotting around the country, and she has this extended family who are now stepping up and stepping in for her.
Sally, have you personally interviewed Prince Charles?
Well, I've met him a number of times.
No, but have you?
But we had, when I was talking to his advisors at the beginning of the project, of course, I'll say one thing, the Queen in her 66 years on the throne has never given an interview, and I think she's not going to change her mind anytime soon. He has given interviews back in the mid-90s. He kind of bared his soul to a biographer he chose, and he has been, to his everlasting regret. He said things that were quite wounding to his parents. He talked a lot about Diana. He said on TV that he had been unfaithful, tried to qualify by saying, after the marriage had irretrievably broken down, but it was basically he had admitted adultery on camera, which was not a good idea. And so he likes to talk about his charities, but as far the kind of interview I wanted to do with him, which was basically to ask him a lot of personal questions, he was not all that keen to do. And the thing about doing an interview with him in the context of a book like mine means that you have to accept a lot of conditions, like they need to read the book and approve it. And so I just said, no, I don't think that would work out. But they were savvy enough to give me a lot of cooperation anyway. I mean, I was able to interview a lot of his senior people, and I was given tours of Poundbury and the home farm and the garden at Highgrove and Dumfries House, and I traveled around the world with him and went to Sri Lanka and Malta and traveled around the country with him. So I felt that and before I did the book, I'd been to 7 of these dinners at Buckingham Palace and St. James's Palace, so I had a kind of a really great take in a very informal way on his dynamic with Camilla. So, the last part of that is that he has had so much to say about so many things over the years that, unless I gave him sodium pentothal or something, he probably wouldn't have said too much more to me.
Let's see.
Oh.
Okay.
Can you give us the skinny on The Crown?
Oh, the skinny on the Crown. Well, it would probably take another 2 hours, but suffice it to say that my poor husband regrets having watched the second season with me, because I spent a lot of time throwing pillows at the television set, jumping up and down, screaming. There's an awful lot of it that's made up. I'll give you just a couple of examples. In the episode, all the stuff about Philip's trip around the world, how it was a 5-month stag do. It actually was 4 months. It was totally made up. He was not, bonking a woman in every port. It was a serious trip for him. He took a polar explorer with him. He took a painting tutor with him. He entertained over 1,500 people. I have 2 books of speeches that he gave during the Commonwealth tour. It was a serious thing that he did. The portrayal of Philip in general, I think, is exceedingly unfair and distorted and even malicious. But in that whole sort of dramatic scene where he comes back from the tour and he walks under the airplane and he and the Queen are looking daggers at each other, and then they spend the night on the Royal Yacht Britannia and talk about the possibility of divorce, and he demands to be made a prince. That is all completely made up. Completely made up. What happened when he returned and he walked up the steps of that airplane was that when he had been in Antarctica, he and his colleagues had all grown beards, and the Queen was very amused by this. And by the way, she and he were on the phone, radio, telephone all the time, so it wasn't as if they were out of touch. She knew he had a beard, and she knew he had to shave it off. So he walked up the steps, walked into the airplane. There was the Queen, her ladies-in-waiting, and her top courtiers in a row wearing red beards. And, it was a moment of lightheartedness, high hilarity. And then they spent 2 wonderful days together before they had a state visit to Portugal. And that's just an example of how wrong-headed it is. The Kennedy episode was just it was a classic example of Peter taking a series of factual events. Yes, the Kennedys went to England after they'd been to Paris and Vienna. Yes, there was a dinner for them at Buckingham Palace. Yes, Jackie said a few catty things about the Queen. We're talking about a woman with really big hair, and she said, well, she had a flat hairstyle, stuff like that. But it was nothing like the tenor of the comments that were depicted in The Crown. There were many, many things about that were completely invented and off base. The Queen did not take Jackie on a private tour of the private quarters and sit in their evening gowns with their corgis at their feet and confide in each other. Queen wouldn't do that. I mean, also, just one aspect of the Queen's character is that she would not have been jealous of Jackie Kennedy and she would not have wanted, that's just not the way. She's the least egotistical person you can imagine. She doesn't like to, she's never seen any of the movies about her. She's never seen the Queen. She never went to see the audience. She's certainly not seeing The Crown. And nor is Philip, although I've been told that he's quite wounded by what he's heard. The idea that she would go to Ghana to try and one-up Jackie's visit to Paris is like turning it into Crystal and whatever her name was, and in the mud wrestling, and in a soap opera, Dynasty. Thank you. So it trivialized it in a kind of irresponsible way. Jackie never had a private audience with the Queen at Windsor Castle and confessed to her that she'd been injected with Benzedrine. And it just sort of goes on and on. And so I think without ruining your viewing experience, I think you should look upon it as if you were watching Downton Abbey, and that this is historical fiction with, take it with a pinch of salt. Read the books, you'll find out the real story. It was interesting to me to find out that Wikipedia, after the debut of the second season, they measure how many searches there are for Wikipedia. And the Queen had been like 15th, and she went up to number 1 because there were people actually going to Wikipedia and saying, wait a minute, did this happen? Did that happen? Did this happen? It's not always the most accurate place to go, but at least people were sort of skeptical. And I think a measure of skepticism is a good idea. But I could go chapter and verse for hours, episode by episode.
I think we only have time for one more question. Okay, I'm coming. Hold on.
After talking to a lot of Charles's friends, do you think he was ever in love with Diana for a few years, maybe, or some of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Was he in love with Diana? I mean, I think he certainly, in the weeks before he proposed, he was very uncertain. He was vacillating a lot. He went to Switzerland to ski with two of his best friends, and they basically said, you really should do this. I mean, one of the problems was Diana's name was being dragged through the mud. His father had written him a letter saying, you either fish or cut bait. You let this poor woman go, or you propose to her and make an honest woman of her. So he had that, and he felt a little bit coerced. But on the other hand, she was so incredibly beguiling and charming. And he sort of looked to his grandparents. It's interesting. And, it took poor Prince Bertie 4 times. He proposed to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon 4 times before she finally accepted him. Poor stammering, incredibly sweet man. And so, he said to more than one person, Charles, I can learn to love Diana the way my grandmother learned to love my grandfather. And I think if Diana had, if she had had a solid sense of herself. I mean, I've often thought if she had the wiles of one of my previous biographical subjects, Pamela Harriman, who also got married at 19, he never would have thought for a nanosecond about Camilla Parker Bowles, but she didn't. She just didn't, she was too insecure. She was consumed with jealousy about Camilla. And so I think he's not a cynic. That much I know about him. And he really wanted the marriage to work, but it was already off the rails even before they walked down the aisle at St. Paul's, I'm afraid to say.
Well, I'm sure we could talk all night, but people have places to go. So I want to say thank you again to Sally for coming, and to Anda Smith for Anda Hutchins for making this possible. There's still a couple of books for sale in the lobby, and thank you again to Elm Street Books for partnering, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you